Today in the shop we're going to look at differentials. This is a 7.5-inch Ford differential. You'll find these in the Ranger pickups and Mustangs, light duty Mustangs, V6, 4-cylinder, etc. You'll find them in Airstars. There's a version of this used in some of the newer cars like Thunderbirds, but it's just the center housing with independent rear suspension and CB axles. Still a 7.5-inch Ford though, and the parts do interchange. So this one is probably going to get used in some sort of an open air roadster at some point. So I want to take it apart and just kind of look at it, see what's going on, see what it needs, if anything. I know this one is not a limited slip. The Fords are kind of nice because they give you these tags. And you can see on that tag there's a 3, a 4, and a 5. And that's the ratio, 3:45 ratio. You'll also see there is no L between the 3 and the 4. And that means that unfortunately this is not a limited slip. Yet. So I'm going to tear this thing apart and we'll talk about differentials for a little bit. The 7.5-inch Ford, the 8.8-inch Ford, and the GM 10-bolt are all very similar. They're all C-clip axles. So they all have axles with a little hat on the end of them where the C-clip goes in to hold it in place. And disassembly is relatively straightforward. Got to shut in on the axles. Once I shove in on the axles, you can take a magnet and you can pull the C-clips out. So one for the right side, one for the left side. Once you do that, you don't have to pull the axles all the way out. I'm just going to pull them out a little bit on each side. That'll allow me to pull the carrier out. And then the next step is to go ahead and pull these bolts out. These are the carrier caps. These caps are not asymmetric. They have to be put in the same orientation. You can't flip them over. So they have to be on the correct side and in the correct orientation. These have little mark points outward. Little triangle points outward. So I'm going to set this over here. So I know that one goes on that side. And I'll set this one over here. So I know that one goes on that side. Ford differentials don't have a tremendous amount of preload on the carrier. I find most GM differentials have quite a bit. By preload, I mean the force that's pushing in on these bearing races. So they make a special tool for that to spread this housing a little bit so it just pops right out. But as I said, the Fords usually aren't in there very heavy anyway. You can usually just pop them out with a pry bar. Like so. There's our carrier with our races and our carrier bearings. Inside we have spider gears. We'll get to those in a second. There's a carrier shim that came out of the right side, so I'm going to put this over here on the right. There's another one from the left side, right here. Do that over here on the left. Pinion fell right out. That usually doesn't happen. And here's our pinion. This is the Driveshaft Yoke. And there's our empty housing. This is what's known as a crush sleeve or a collapsible spacer. We'll talk in depth on this in a minute. So this one's a 3:45 ratio. And the way you get that is you just count up the teeth on the ring and the pinion. I'm going to do that real quick. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11 pinion teeth. And we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23, 26, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, 34, 35, 36, 37, 38 ring gear teeth. Now we do some simple math. And we get 345. So you'll notice this number repeats. 3, 4, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5, 4, 5. That's what's known as a hunting gear set. So when these gear sets are manufactured from the factory, or in a factory, I think Richmond Gear made them for Ford, but I'm not positive on that. After they come out of the milling machine, the teeth on the ring and the pinion is put into a special machine and they are lapped with a lapping compound. On a hunting gear set, every teeth on the pinion contacts every teeth on the ring at some point. It might take 50 revolutions to get there, but every single tooth will contact every single tooth on the ring. They're not all like that. Here's an example of another ring and pinion. So this is out of a 9-inch. We're going to count these real quick. That was already marked for me. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. Let me do that again. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13 on the pinion. $39 teeth on the ring. Once again, we'll do some math. So 39 divided by 13 equals 3. Non-repeating number. It's a whole number. This is what's known as a non-hunting gear set. These are very rare. In fact, you only find a gear set like this if you work on an older Ford. Aftermarket gears are usually not set up this way. You'll also notice that this gear set has a timing mark right there, a little triangle. There should be an equivalent mark on the pinion. It's probably just that paint mark, actually. But these gears have to be timed, because when these gear sets are lapped from the factory, not every tooth on the pinion hits every tooth on the ring. So as these go around and round, as it comes back, That tooth on the pinion is going to contact that tooth on the ring every single time. So as it goes around, it's going to hit 3 teeth on the ring, but the same 3 teeth, because it's a whole number, 3. So equally divisible. These gear sets have to be timed. So I'm assuming that that pinion tooth with the paint mark goes where that triangle goes, and that's how you time those. So be aware of that when working with older cars. Sometimes you run into a set of non-hunting gears and there'll be timing marks on them. And if you count the number of teeth on the ring and the pinion before you take it apart and it's a whole number, or a non-repeating number like a 350 to 1 gear set, then you need to mark the pinion and the ring so that when you put it back together it goes in exactly the same place. If you don't, you'll get accelerated wear. And with accelerated wear comes noise and all kinds of fun stuff. So, okay, this one's a 345 to 1. I'll pop out a spider gear here real quick. So here's our side gears and spider gears. Mesh up real nice. These look pretty good. I can reuse these if I wanted to. So I'll put those aside for now. So I know a lot of techs, a lot of guys, a lot of backyard guys and gals that they don't like to deal with differentials because they're just afraid of them. And they really don't have to be, once you realize a few important things. Probably the most important thing when dealing with differentials and differential gear sets is if you pull the pinion nut off for any reason. For instance, if you pull the pinion nut off to replace a pinion seal, always replace both the nut and the collapsible spacer. Always. If you do that and you set it up properly, you won't have any problems. That's very critical. Can you get away with it if you don't? Yes, you can. Have I done it? Yes, I have. But the concern here is that every time you take this nut off and put this nut back on, this collapsible spacer collapses a little bit more. And this collapsible spacer is the only thing that's holding friction against the threads of the nut so the nut stays on. So what I mean by that is, let me see if I can find a loose pinion bearing here. I should have one laying around. No, I don't, so I'll go ahead and pop this one out real quick. Otherwise, what I'm trying to describe here will be very difficult. That's an oil slinger, it's not a shim. The only purpose of that is to deflect oil back into this bearing and not into the seal. Okay, so here we go. So we have 2 bearings on the pinion and we have a nut. And in the middle that's going to be the yoke, Driveshaft yoke. So something like this. And we have a nut. Nut holds the yoke on. Nut holds preload between these 2 bearings. The collapsible spacer is what forces this nut to be tight against the threads once you tighten it down. So these things take big torque to get that collapsible spacer to collapse when you're setting them up. between 200 and 400 foot-pounds typically. If it doesn't take at least 150 foot-pounds, I would be concerned that you either have a wrong one or it's already been collapsed. Should take a lot of force to collapse this. So usually between 300 and 400 foot-pounds is what I see. So you have one of these, it's brand new, it's thick. You put it on here and you start torquing the nut down. And you torque it a little bit at a time, and you measure the preload, which is just basically the rotating friction of the pinion. And you measure that with an inch-pound wrench. And typically a new differential is going to be somewhere around 12 inch-pounds, I think. And that just tells you that the distance between the two bearings is correct. So you tighten the nut, you collapse the spacer down, you get these two set up to where they're providing about 12 inch-pounds of rotating force, and you're done. And interestingly enough, when you go out and you hit the throttle on time and come back in and check your preload, it'll be smooth as silk. There'll be no resistance at all. So they seat that quickly. Now, if you take this apart to replace a pinion seal, and you just slap a new seal in it and you put your nut on, you tighten it down. Every time you do that, this will collapse a little bit further. That means the force, and you can't really do it that way, because as you torque this down, if you were to take the nut off and put it back on, now all you would do is just run the nut back into the same place. And that's kind of the hack way of doing a pinion seal is well, I've done it this way. You put a torque wrench on the nut, and you measure the torque that it takes to break it loose. And you also mark the nut where it is in relation to the pinion. So on the end of it, I just put a little hash mark and then a hash mark so that I know where that nut ended up, or where it was to start with. And then when I go back together, I'll torque it to the same foot-pounds, and I'll make sure that those two marks line up. And I'll use lots of Loctite on the nut. And will that work? It might. But remember, every time you torque this thing down, every single time you do a pinion seal, and if it's an old vehicle, it may have had 4 or 5 pinion seals in its lifetime. Every time that nut is torqued down, this collapsible spacer shrinks a little bit more. And you run into the risk that this little device isn't exerting enough force against the yoke and the nut to keep this nut from backing off. It takes a lot of friction on this nut between the threads of the nut and the threads of the pinion to hold it in place. So, smart move is just to replace this every single time. Almost all the major parts stores have these. There's one that's not been crushed yet. So you can buy these. I think that the GM 10 bolt and the Ford 7.5 and Ford 8.8 all use exactly the same crush sleeve. So pretty common item. You can find them anywhere. And then run it down with something holding the yoke, the driveshaft yoke, so it cannot spin. What I do is I just put a bar that I've made real long, and I just torque it down to these 2 bowl holes, and then I put my torque wrench on the nut, and I run it down I run it all the way down until I start feeling friction, and then 1/8 of a turn at a time until that rotating force with the inch-pound wrench is correct. So this is an inch-pound wrench. I bought this for doing transmissions, but it is useful for this. You have to have a beam type. A clicker type won't work. But all you do is you torque this nut down until you start to feel resistance. Put the inch-pound wrench on there, and you measure the rotating friction of the yoke. And on a Ford with new bearings, it should be right around 12 to 14 inch-pounds. Once it gets there, you're done. So, you can get away with it. I mean, especially if you know that the pinion seal has not been replaced in the past. Put a new pinion seal in it, torque the nut down, make sure the nut ends up exactly in the same place on the pinion that it was. So you want it to be exactly the same place. Use lots of Loctite on the nut, and you might get lucky. Or it might loosen up and destroy your differential. And I've seen that happen countless times. It does happen, so it's always better to replace it. Now, when you're servicing these, you have to get the outer bearing out before you can get the crush sleeve out. So when you're disassembling the diff, this is all inside the housing. So the nut comes off, the yoke comes off. Now you have to reach in and you have to pull the slinger out. Take that off. And you have to reach in with something and pull the bearing out. Sometimes that's difficult, especially on GM differentials, because there's actually a little bit of an interference fit between the bearing and the pinion. It just doesn't pop off of there. If that's the case, you have to take the differential completely apart, pull the housing, pull the axles, pull the housing, pull the carrier, not housing, pull the carrier, and then just gently tap the pinion forward until the bearing comes off. Only way to do it. It only takes an extra 15 minutes to do that. So it's well worth it. Maybe a little longer if you have disc brakes. So that's the single biggest hiccup with differential service, is to make sure you replace this item and then torque it down. Everything else is pretty straightforward. Measuring backlash is relatively simple. Marking the gear sets and getting a pattern with gear marking paste, pretty simple. There's charts online that will tell you with a certain pattern which way the carrier or which way the pinion has to go to rectify it. That stuff's all straightforward. You don't need too many special tools to do differential work. The only one you absolutely have to have are the torque wrenches and a dial indicator. And the dial indicator is just to measure backlash. That's it. So to decrease backlash, you're going to move the ring gear toward the pinion. To increase backlash, you're going to move it away. So to decrease backlash, you're going to move the ring toward the pinion. To increase it, you're going to move it away. And that's done with changing the thickness of the carrier shims. So if I wanted to increase the backlash on this differential, I would make this one thicker and this one thinner. And that would move the entire carrier away from the pinion. If I wanted to decrease it, I would make this one thicker. I'd make this one thinner. And if there's no other problems with the differential, I would keep the total thickness the same. So if you put these together and you measured the thickness, I would keep that the same. I would just change this one and change this one to slide the whole carrier over to change the backlash. Fords typically like about 12 thousandths. GM typically likes about 8. Best to look up those specs. Everybody's different, so, but most Fords that I've seen like about 12. Almost forgot. So you'll notice that the 9-inch gear set has an extra bearing. And the reason for that, this is no stronger, or not much stronger than an A8. But the reason they have this extra bearing on here is because the distance between these two bearings is much shorter than a 7.5, an 8.8, a GM 10 volt, etc. I think you can even see that. So the distance between the two bearings, much less on a 9-inch. That's why you need that extra support at the end. something else to talk about is reverse cut and high pinion. So reverse cut just means the gear teeth are cut at an opposite diagonal, and high pinion is for moving a rear differential to the front. And the reason for that is on a low pinion differential that's in the rear, as the differential spins, or as the pinion spins, it's driving the ring gear and the vehicle forward. And there are two forces at play on the pinion. The first is deflection away from the ring gear, and the second is thrust forward on this bearing. That's in a low pinion diff that's in the rear of the vehicle. So as it turns, it's pushing the ring gear teeth that way, which the opposite force on the pinion is forward against this bearing. So when you have a high pinion that's in the front, interestingly enough, it's exactly the same, because now you can picture that this is now in the front, and this is driving the front wheels. So the front of the vehicle is that way, the rear of the vehicle is this way, the left side of the vehicle is this way, this is the right side of the vehicle. And as this is turning this front axle, the front tires forward, the forces are still the same. It's pushing forward on the ring gear teeth, but the pinion is now higher than the center line of the axle. The force on the bearing is in the same place. So the thrust on the pinion is forward and away, but the bearing, the big bearing, takes up most of that force. So if you put a high pinion differential in the rear of a vehicle, which some guys and gals will do to get the drive shaft up on a four-wheel drive. Now we have a problem, because now when you're shoving, or when you're turning the ring is turning the opposite direction to make the wheels go forward. So pinion is higher than the axle center line. This would be the left side of the vehicle, this would be the right side of the vehicle, that's the rear of the vehicle, this is the front of the vehicle, it's turning. But remember, it's going to be reverse cut gear, so as I turn it this way, it's actually going forward. But for illustration purposes, I'm just going to run it the opposite direction. Now you can see that the thrust on the ring and the pinion is exactly opposite. So as this thing turns, it's now pulling the pinion and pulling the ring gear teeth toward the pinion. The thrust is in the opposite direction. Here's why that is weaker. Because now we're not thrusting against the big bearing that's firmly seated in the housing. Now we're thrusting against the small bearing, and worse, we're pushing against the nut and the threads on this nut, where in the opposite scenario, you're not. It's pushing against this bearing, which is firmly seated in the housing. If you put a high pinion in the rear, all the force is against this bearing, the yoke, and the nut. So this becomes the weak link in a high pinion diff that's moved to the rear of the vehicle. And that's why it's not ideal. But the reason most setups get away from it is because it's a 1-ton axle in like a Jeep Wrangler. So it's massively oversized for the application, and it will work. But if it were like a stock Dana 44 high pinion, it would never last. Under any serious abuse, this would give. The nut would loosen up. It's also pushing against the crush sleeve too, so that's bad. No, I'm sorry. This is pushing against. Let's see. Force comes through. Pulling. No, it's not. It's just pushing against the bearing. The bearing, the yoke, and the nut. The crush sleeve's floating in the middle, so no worries there. But still, not the ideal setup. So it's always better to have a high pinion in the front and then a low pinion in the rear. That's the strongest setup if you can set it up that way. just going to temporarily zip this together so I can take it off the bench. These shims are cast iron. You got to be really careful with them; they will break. Some example of how you shim these side to side is by using shims like this. So they come in different thicknesses, and you could pick a slightly different shim, and then you could start adding these to kind of shift this thing back and forth to get the backlash where you want it. To set pinion depth, there's a shim under the big bearing. So there's a shim that sits in there that allows this pinion to be moved in and out depending on the thickness of this shim. That's how you set pinion depth. Drop the C-clips in. When you drop the C-clip in, you just pull out on the axle. That'll hold it in place. Like so. This pin is what holds everything together, and then this bolt is what holds the pin in the carrier. So it goes in like that. On final assembly, you want to use a couple drops of RT, or not RTV, Loctite on the threads of the bolt so it doesn't back out. And you also want to check and make sure that the carrier, it's a high mileage car, doesn't have a whole lot of play between the pin and the carrier, because what can happen is if it's got a lot of play, C-clip slid down. if it has a lot of play, what can happen is as this differential moves back and forth, or this pin moves back and forth due to the play, it can snap the end of this off. If this breaks, sometimes it breaks right in the middle of those threads, and you take this part out and the rest of this is stuck in the carrier. And now you're stuck drilling it out. And at that point, if you ever find a situation like that, you need to find out where the wear is, whether it's in the carrier or the pin, and replace either or both of those items if the wear is excessive, because it'll just happen again if you don't. This is a 9-inch center section. Perfectly good center section, although just from sitting in the garage the teeth are kind of rusted up on the ring and probably the pinion too, and I'm not really going to lose sleep over that, and in a second you will see why. This is actually a very ratio. It's a 250 to 1. It's out of a big Ford or Lincoln sedan, I believe. But you'll notice this extra bearing on the pinion has got some pitting or brittling, they call it. This is caused by an imperfection in either the bearing or the pinion. And every time it runs around and hits that spot, it's just like a pothole on the street. It just keeps getting bigger and bigger and spreading. Because of that, this pinion is no good. Can't be reused. So I'm not losing sleep over the rust on the ring gear. Pinion actually looks pretty good though. That part of it, but so the 9-inch, a little different. This is similar to a Chrysler 8 3/4. Instead of using shims to move the carrier back and forth, we've got threaded sliders that will move the carrier. You turn this one out and turn this one in, and it'll slide it in to reduce backlash, or you could turn this one out and turn that one in, move the ring gear away from the pinion to increase backlash. So no shims required on this. Pinion is a little different too. Instead of a shim under the bearing here, what they're going to use instead is a shim under the pinion carrier here, which moves the whole pinion carrier out. So if you want to pull your pinion away from the ring gear, use a thicker shim. If you want to move it closer to the ring gear, to set pinion depth a little closer, use a thinner one. So a little different. And I guess that's all I have for differentials right now. That housing looks good. It's kind of a lightweight housing, the 7.5-inch Ford housing, but it's going to go in a very lightweight car, so it'll work just fine. I do want to find a limited slip carrier for it and install that, but other than that, I think the ratio might be just about right too for what I'm doing. So that about covers it for this video. Thanks for watching.